Opening the path for your queen and king's bishop, this establishes a solid central pawn presence. Fighting for central influence, black immediately stakes a claim, creating an asymmetrical battlefield with significant strategic implications. Instantly aiming for central control, this knight establishes a powerful presence, potentially dictating the game's early direction. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside development while embracing the open Sicilian struggle. Developing the knight here builds a central pawn chain and prepares for kingside expansion. Unleashing the knight towards the center immediately challenges white's queenside development. Prudently reinforcing g4 to prevent any immediate knight or bishop outpost. This move subtly prepares potential kingside expansion while sacrificing a tempo. Developing the knight further solidifies control of the central dark squares and prepares for eventual pawn breaks, a sensible follow-up. Opening the center immediately tests black's pawn structure and can lead to sharp tactical battles. Opening the central files now creates immediate tactical possibilities and forces white to consider the consequences of pushing their d-pawn. Reclaiming the center with a knight redeploys your cavalry to a more dynamic square, immediately contesting black's central control and preparing for potential king's side initiative. Unleashing the pawn creates a bold central presence, challenging white's knight immediately and seizing vital central squares. This aggressive advance promises to disrupt white's comfortable knight positioning and potentially open lines for black's pieces. It's a decisive commitment, signaling an intent to fight for the initiative. Reclaiming the knight to f3 unwinds the tactical tension, opting for a more solid development and preparing to castle kingside, while subtly challenging black's advanced e-pawn and eyeing the d5 square for future queenside pressure. This natural developing move finally addresses the king's flank, preparing to castle and bring another piece into the game's complex fight for central control. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal here initiates a classic Sicilian fight, aiming to pressure black's kingside and prepare for potential castling. The bishop now eyes the f7 square, a common target in many Sicilian lines, and contributes to white's central influence while subtly restricting black's piece mobility. Securing the monarch is paramount in this nascent Sicilian Najdorf structure, and castling short achieves that crucial defensive objective while preparing for subsequent middle-game maneuvers. Castling into safety, white now seeks to connect the rooks and prepare for further central action, a common goal after opening lines. Bringing the bishop to a central outpost now creates a strong blockade against white's kingside advance, potentially preparing for a later queenside counterplay. Relocating the bishop to b3 aims to maintain pressure along the a2-g8 diagonal, subtly questioning black's central pawn structure while preparing for potential queenside expansion or a kingside attack. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure against potential knight incursions becomes a priority here, subtly preparing for future central pawn breaks by preventing the e5 pawn from becoming a lonely outpost under attack. Initiating a centralized rook on the e-file aims to contest open lines and pressure black's central pawns and potential weaknesses, simultaneously preparing for a potential queenside expansion or an eventual kingside attack by creating a more flexible pawn structure for white. Unleashing the knight to the rim often hints at a broader positional restructuring, aiming to gain control of the c4 square and potentially pressure white's light-squared bishop, while simultaneously preparing for future pawn breaks or piece transfers. Anchoring the bishop to the long diagonal provides crucial defense for the kingside and prepares for a potential queenside advance by clearing the d2 square for the queen, while also eyeing potential breaks in the center. Asserting presence on the queenside, black's move prepares to challenge the bishop's influence and potentially open the b-file, aiming to neutralize white's queenside space advantage and foster counterplay by freeing the knight on a5. The queen now occupies a central hub, eyeing both the kingside and potential breakthroughs on the queenside, while simultaneously bolstering the kingside defense. Focusing on piece harmony, the queen gracefully shifts to c7, not only bolstering the g7 pawn's defense, but also preparing to join the kingside action. perhaps via a future QD-AT8G6 maneuver, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the queenside's central thrust potential. Establishing a presence on the d-file is a crucial step for white, aiming to exert pressure along this open column and potentially support a pawn push or future piece activity. Exchanging the knight for the bishop in this manner offers black a certain clarity, simplifying the pawn structure and potentially easing defensive burdens on the queen side, though it does hand white a more comfortable central pawn presence and an open d-file for their rook. Capturing the knight on b3 solidifies white's pawn structure in the center and opens the c-file for potential rook activity, a welcome development given black's somewhat passive piece placement. This recapture presents white with a choice. Either maintain the doubled pawns to keep the center solid and potentially build an attack on the queen side, or to consider a recapture with the queen to preserve symmetry and allow for more immediate piece development. The knight's departure from the queen side reduces black's attacking potential in that sector, while white now has enhanced control over the central squares and can look to exploit the newly opened c-file. This move signals white's intention to transition from development towards a more assertive middle game strategy, seeking to gain an advantage through pawn structure and open lines. Seizing that queenside majority with b5 initiates a bold pawn thrust, aiming to expand black's territory and potentially disrupt white's harmonious piece placement, while simultaneously creating some structural weaknesses on the queenside that white might seek to exploit. A bold attempt to lock down the queenside and deny black any further pawn incursions, though it concedes queenside space and might create isolated weaknesses later. Probing the queenside, this maneuver seeks to activate the queen from its somewhat passive post on c7, aiming to exert pressure on the b-file and potentially support a kingside pawn advance later. The queenside structure is quite dynamic, with pawns on b5 and a6 creating a tense frontier, and the queen's relocation might be a precursor to further pawn expansion or a strategic regrouping of minor pieces. Sensing a potential blockade on the queen side, white proactively reroutes his knight, seeking to activate it via the c4 square, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king. Black fortifies the queenside pawn structure, preparing to exert pressure on the c-file and potentially initiate a kingside advance with f5. This strategic repositioning of the knight aims to bolster the queenside defense, creating a more robust pawn structure and potentially preparing a future pawn advance like b5, while simultaneously unblocking the d2 square for other pieces. This bold central thrust immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, challenging white's pawn structure and opening up lines for black's pieces. The pawn at d5 aims to disrupt white's coordination, particularly the knight's, and potentially create weaknesses in white's kingside defense if the pawn advance leads to exchanges. It's a move that signals black's intent to seize the initiative and force white to react to a rapidly changing battlefield. The opening of the d-file after this capture dramatically alters the positional landscape, offering immediate tactical possibilities and forcing black to reevaluate their defensive structure. Seizing the central open file with the knight, black initiates a bold pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and create dynamic counterplay. This aggressive thrust, *nxd5*, forces white to make a decision regarding the pawn and opens a path for black's pieces. Observe how the knight's new central outpost threatens to become a formidable attacking point, potentially pinning white's pieces or even forcing a queenside pawn chain collapse. Consider the delicate balance of material versus initiative. Black is betting that the disruption and active piece play will outweigh the pawn deficit. Notice the strategic implications for white. They must now carefully assess if they can consolidate their material advantage or if they will be forced into a defensive posture, reacting to black's initiative. The geometry of the board is dramatically altered by this bold pawn grab, promising an exciting phase of the game. Initiating a pawn storm on the queen side by white now might feel tempting, but this immediate queen maneuver towards the king side, targeting the b3 pawn, signals a more subtle strategic shift. The queen's departure from the d-file creates a momentary void, but its presence here could destabilize black's queenside structure, particularly if black attempts to advance their b-pawn further. This aims to sow discord and possibly create weaknesses that can be exploited later. Unleashing the queen to c6 immediately challenges white's queenside structure, aiming to exploit the c3 pawn's isolation and the open c-file black now covets. This aggressive positioning hints at an imminent pawn storm or a repositioning of pieces to pressure the king's defenses. The immediate threat is the potential exchange of queens, which might simplify the position, but could also activate white's pieces more than intended if not carefully managed. Black's initiative is palpable, forcing white to consider defensive measures rather than continuing their own plans. The capture on d5 seizes the critical central square, immediately challenging black's pawn structure and opening the c-file for potential action. Reclaiming the central pawn immediately initiates a crucial pawn exchange, simplifying the position and opening lines. The bishop on d5 now exerts significant pressure on the c4 square and supports potential pawn pushes down the b-file, creating a dynamic imbalance where black aims to leverage their active pieces against white's slightly hampered kingside. Unleashing an aggressive queen into the enemy camp, the white queen now eyes the vulnerable kingside, seeking to exploit any weakness that might arise from black's pawn structure. Black boldly seeks to seize the initiative, pushing forward with the f-pawn to challenge white's central pawn chain and potentially open a diagonal for the bishop. This aggressive pawn push simultaneously aims to restrict white's knight and create counterplay on the kingside, but it does leave the king somewhat exposed if white can skillfully exploit the ensuing complications. It's a calculated risk designed to disrupt white's current, rather passive, setup. Sacrificing the queen here opens up fascinating possibilities, aiming to disrupt black's strong central pawn chain and create a decisive initiative through piece activity. The sudden queen excursion forces black to reevaluate their entire structure, particularly the safety of their king, which is now more exposed with the queen off the board to defend. This bold exchange fundamentally alters the tactical landscape, shifting the focus from pawn play to the dynamic interplay of remaining pieces. The resulting material imbalance, though significant, is less about raw count and more about the potential for white's knights and bishops to exploit open lines and create mating threats before black can consolidate. It's a calculated gamble to trade material for initiative, hoping to overwhelm black's defenses. Black unpins the knight by offering a knight exchange, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially free up the f-file for future activity. Reclaiming the open c-file after black's pawn sacrifice is a vital priority, opening avenues for rook activity and pressuring black's central structure. Sacrificing the bishop opens a fascinating tactical labyrinth, directly exposing the white king's precarious position and creating immediate threats on the g-file. Black is prioritizing initiative and king's safety over material for now. Striking back with the queen, white immediately corrects the material imbalance and simplifies the position, forcing black to recapture and potentially opening lines for white's pieces. This decisive queen exchange aims to neutralize black's initiative and transition towards a more manageable endgame, where white might enjoy a slight advantage due to better pawn structure. The immediate threat to the d5 pawn is removed, and white's king remains relatively safe while black's monarch faces more exposure. The exchange of bishops offers a welcome clarity, simplifying the board and ushering in an endgame where the connected passed pawns on the queenside become a significant long-term threat for black if white cannot neutralize them efficiently. Re-establishing the bishop's dominion over the vital diagonals after the forced exchange on g2, this bishop now eyes the weakened dark squares around black's king, potentially preparing for a future kingside assault or at least restricting black's maneuvering options. Redirecting the rook to a more active file, aiming to pressure white's weakened pawn structure on the kingside. Activating the king from its passive castled position allows it to participate in the ensuing exchanges, potentially reinforcing central pawns or preparing for a more active role in the later stages of the game. Re-establishing piece activity, the bishop slides to a more dynamic diagonal, preparing to contest the open files and create potential threats against the enemy king. The bishop repositions, aiming to control key diagonals and offer support to the d-pawn, while simultaneously defending against potential threats on the kingside and preparing for a more active role in the center. Liberating the bishop from its cramped position on g2 opens up the diagonal for potential pressure on the queen side, while also preparing for future pawn advances or repositioning to a more active square like g3 or h3 if the opportunity arises. Challenging the e3 bishop's reign, the rook's relocation to the c-file aims to exploit potential weaknesses along that open column and pressure black's queenside pawn structure. A bold gamble to inject life into a stalled position, this maneuver immediately brings the rook into a more active, albeit somewhat exposed, role on the king side. Focusing the king towards safety is paramount now that the immediate tactical fireworks have subsided. This maneuver aims to unblock the rook and centralize it, potentially contesting the critical open file or supporting a pawn advance. A desperate attempt to activate the rook and challenge the open file. Reasserting control over the d-file, the knight aims to redeploy, perhaps to e5 or d4, aiming to disrupt black's recently established pawn structure and pressure the queen side. Reclaiming the outpost on d7 with the bishop initiates a crucial defensive maneuver, seeking to solidify the pawn structure and prevent further encroachment by white's knight, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the bishop to a more active square, perhaps the a7 diagonal, once the immediate threat is neutralized. Unlocking the king's flank with the rook's invasion opens up a crucial attacking corridor, potentially disrupting black's defensive harmony and creating immediate pressure on the g-file, which could unravel their position if not met with precise countermeasures. A crucial exchange is initiated, aiming to simplify the position and potentially exploit the open g-file that will materialize. A crucial moment for consolidating the material advantage. This recapture on g1 allows white to clear the rook's path for potential activity and signals a transition into an endgame where the extra pawn should be decisive. Reclaiming the king's central presence, kf7 activates the monarch, preparing to join the fray and potentially support pawn advances or defensive maneuvers in the center, a critical step as the material imbalance shifts and the endgame looms. A calculated risk to reclaim central space and open attacking avenues. This knight repositioning aims to disrupt black's developing coordination and pressure the weakened kingside, though it does leave the kingside pawn structure somewhat exposed for future skirmishes. A strategic repositioning begins as black's bishop abandons the active e3 square, seeking a less exposed post on d7, aiming to rejoin the defense of the kingside pawns and potentially support future pawn advances, hinting at a desire to consolidate and explore new avenues of play after the recent exchanges. Pushing the f-pawn opens a crucial diagonal for your bishop, potentially creating immediate threats against the black king's current shelter, and offering a path for your rook to join the attack via the third rank. The rook's relocation to the open file immediately combats white's piece activity and prepares to contest the crucial central space, potentially setting up a later foray towards the enemy king. Relocating the king to the f2 square aims to bring it into the game more actively, preparing to support the pawn structure and potentially join the fight for central control as the queens are off the board. Reasserting central influence, this rook shift aims to contest the open file, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities by activating the piece on its new diagonal. Opening up lines for the rook to occupy the central file was a good idea, but relocating the knight to a more active square in the endgame's infancy allows for better piece coordination and potential pawn advances on the queen side. A timely repositioning of the bishop, this piece aims to contest the central files and prevent white's knight from establishing an outpost on d4. Initiating a strategic redeployment of the rook to the open d-file, this maneuver aims to generate pressure and potentially create pawn weaknesses for black's defensive structure. Unleashing a pawn storm in this position, black aims to disrupt white's central control and create chaos, hoping to exploit any defensive weaknesses that might emerge from the ensuing complications. The monarch retreats, a sensible reaction to the sudden aggressive thrust on the king side, seeking refuge behind what remains of the pawn's shield. Unleashing the pawn is a double-edged sword, creating an immediate threat against the white queen and bishop on the g-file, while simultaneously exposing the black king to potential discovery attacks along the newly opened diagonal. The knight returns to f4, a seemingly simple repositioning, yet it cleverly anticipates black's exposed king and the looming passed pawn on g5, setting up potential threats along the now open kingside diagonal. Sacrificing the bishop here after the exchange on d5 feels like a desperate attempt to generate counterplay, but it leaves your king precariously exposed and neglects the powerful open files that white now commands. The bishop's retreat finally untangles its pressure on the kingside, preparing to support a central pawn push or defend against the black rook's advance. The long-term objective of freeing the rook on h8 is finally being addressed, seeking to activate it on the kingside. Reactivating the rook on the d-file aims to exploit the now exposed king and create passed pawns. The rook's repositioning to the c-file aims to contest control and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure, but it might be a bit slow to react to the immediate threats developing on the kingside. Clearing a pathway for the king's escape route offers a proactive defense against the encroaching enemy pieces and prepares for potential pawn advances. Sensing an opportunity to disrupt white's pawn structure and gain activity, black maneuvers the rook to the second rank, aiming to exploit the open c-file and create threats against white's king or connected pawns. A strategic redeployment to solidify the d-file pressure and potentially support a future kingside advance. The rook's relocation to the fourth rank aims to disrupt white's king's safety and potentially create mating threats, exploiting the open lines leading towards the enemy monarch. The rook swings over to the open, a file, aiming to exploit the queenside weakness, but black's king is surprisingly exposed in the center and can be a target for infiltration if white can open up the pawn structure further. Seizing the isolated pawn is a desperate attempt to regain material parity, but it leaves the black king exposed in the center and allows white's rook immense freedom on the seventh rank. The monarch is driven from its sanctuary, forcing a reactive stance and inviting open lines for immediate counterplay. The black king, having shuffled its way to the center, now attempts to find refuge on the queenside, a desperate gambit given the open files and the menacing rook. Unlocking the power of the bishop's diagonal, this maneuver prepares to pierce through black's weakened pawn shield and create immediate threats on the kingside, aiming to exploit the open files that have emerged from the recent exchanges. Initiating a final flourish, this checks the king, aiming to dislodge the bishop guarding the white monarch and potentially exposing it to further harassment or a forced exchange. The king scrambles for a safer haven amidst the chaos, seeking refuge from the looming bishop's diagonal. The king's desperate scramble for safety, now pursued by a rook and bishop battery, creates a highly volatile situation where even a single misstep could prove fatal. The king's journey across the board continues, seeking refuge from the relentless pressure, but this particular step to d3 opens a critical diagonal for the opponent's rook. A desperate check, hoping to disrupt white's kingside consolidation and perhaps snag an undefended pawn if white plays carelessly, though the king is now exposed to further checks. The king bravely ventures forward, seeking escape from the immediate danger, but exposes itself to a relentless barrage of checks. Sacrificing material to unchain the g-pawn's advance and create immediate mating threats against the white king is a bold but potentially game-mending strategy. Solidifying the passed pawn by offering some breathing room for the king is a reasonable defensive maneuver. Initiating a final pawn push to break open the position, f3 boldly challenges the white king's defenses and aims to create unstoppable threats. The bishop retreats, aiming to reposition itself to a more active diagonal where it can menace the black king or support a pawn advance down the h-file. Black's pawn, now a formidable force, marches determinedly forward, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create an unstoppable passed threat. The rook's forcing check aims to drive the black king into a more exposed position, potentially opening lines for further attack or forcing a significant material concession. The king's journey to the edge of the board is perilous, and its current placement invites further complications, especially with the open diagonal for white's rook.